computer. Okay, here we go. It's, can you believe it, March 28th. It is the spring semester of 2018. I'm Renee Hobbs. I am here with Matthew and Jordan. This is COM 416. We are kind of in the sad, depressing part. We are in the sad, depressing part of the course because we're learning about propaganda from the Nazi Reich, the Third Reich. And it is humbling. It now seems like it's been 70 years or more since the end of World War II. And when you see the genius at work in the propaganda campaign to influence millions and millions of German people to simply not care about the Jewish people in their communities who were being sent to the gas chambers, who were being excluded from the life of the people, who were being systematically discriminated against. It's actually kind of terrifying. And it's weird how, even though I've been studying this topic for so long, I'm still not desensitized to it. So reading this part of the book and seeing forbidden films, it just conjures up a lot of kind of sadness, you know. And I guess part of my reason for teaching this class in propaganda is that I hope propaganda can be I hope propaganda education can be a positive force, because I want to see more positive propaganda and less negative propaganda. That's the goal. That's the goal. I don't know, just me. Okay, I see Olivia has joined us. Let me see if I can share my screen with you, and we'll take a look at what we're going to talk about today. Share my screen. Okay. All right, so the theme, of course, for today's session is power and persuasion in the racial state. We're seeing in this a bit of the readings, we're seeing about the role of propaganda in creating a national community and in excluding Jews and Romas and homosexuals and people with mental and physical handicaps from that national state. So I want to talk a little bit about your marvelous response to the Flipgrid this week. You got a chance to look at forbidden films and discuss about whether or not the propaganda films should be released to the public. And I want to share with you a couple of highlights that I got as I looked over your Flipgrid responses. Actually, it kind of was a little bit evenly split, I see, with some of you saying, no, those propaganda films should still stay in the vault and should not be released, and others of you saying, no, it's time for them to be released. Most of the people who thought that they should be released had some ideas about certain caveats around maybe the films shouldn't be shown to young people, or maybe they should only be shown in educational settings where there can be commentary like there is now. But you know, in some way, you made a bunch of interesting points. You know, when you ban something, it makes it more attractive, right? So, you know, the appeal of being a 13 or 14-year-old kid and getting kind of pulled into the alt-right scene in Germany and being, you know, getting to watch a, you know, illegal, a forbidden film has a certain allure. Right? The same way that R-rated movies are more attractive to teen boys than PG-rated movies, even when the content is identical. A lot of you talked about the fact that to understand these films, you needed content knowledge, and others of you talked about how what we learned in watching the film was that these films were good films, right? The best of them. And the compelling drama and the storytelling and the visuals were what made them so persuasive. I really, really appreciated the fact that you definitely did get a bit of a balance on the argument, but I also I wanted to share with you the most chilling moment for me in the film, because not too many of you talked about this particular moment, and this is kind of burned into my brain. And so I wanted to share with you this this moment of the film because it's the moment that has kept me up at night, worrying, I think, a little bit, and reflecting on it as something that has some real insight for propaganda. So hold on, let me see if I can just get us back to the film here. I probably should have done this beforehand, but I didn't think to do it. It's the part of the film, it's about the film called Homeland. And Homeland was this film, hold on here. I'm just going to go to the transcript. I'm going to type in Poland. One of the things I love about Alexander Street streaming videos, right? What a great service, right? This is, your generation is so lucky to be able to see films streaming and then see them with transcripts. It's a pretty powerful tool. It's also cool that if you have a full subscription, you can clip bits of film and then remix them to make your own film. That's really interesting. But this film is called Homeland, I think it's called. And I wanted to watch just a little bit and then share what makes this film so chilling. We're seeing a Polish, in this film, the Germans are the victims of the evil Polish aggressors. Let's take a look. There are laws in Poland to protect minorities. The German minority too. I'll give you a tip, Mrs. Thomas. You should not take this dangerous German theory and make it your own. The sudden revelation that you are German. It's no sudden revelation. Homecoming was made to defend the invasion of Poland, which was not portrayed as an invasion, but rather as we're shooting back. It was legitimized in the film. Simultaneously, they legitimized the way in which the Polish people were treated and the brutal political actions of the occupying power. They portray the killing of an enemy, but it's the enemy of the Germans. This enemy denies the Germans their rights. I think it's a film that doesn't get brought into the discourse much. But as a portrayal of the enemy, it's at the same level as Jude Sus for me. Here we see the Germans being harassed by the evil Poles. You will sing, German dog. Fritz, Fritz. The Polish expel the Germans. The Polish, in fact, want to exterminate the Germans, and Hitler comes along as their savior. The German army marches in, and the ethnic Germans are saved and come home into the Reich. It's propaganda that is filled with hatred. The Polish characters are hatefully portrayed. It's hard not to hate them when you watch it. What I find particularly misleading is the use of children to transmit the hatred. The Polish children throw stones at the Germans and burn the Germans' cultural objects as if Slavic peoples were rotten from childhood on. She has a swastika around her neck. Oh, that poor German girl. Listen to that movie music. Everything is reversed. Their own actions are attributed to the others. Images of reversal show up in this film. There's an analogy to the book burnings. People are carted away. The Germans' enemies use Gestapo methods like torture. All the things shown in this film are reversed. It's exactly what the Germans later did to their enemies. So we're seeing the Germans in the prison.
Holy shit. This actually fucking smells like Hawaiian. Dude, it's no fucking joke, right? That's all I have. I think I fucking smoke it. Holy shit. No joke. Wow. Right? Some of the stankiest off my fucking stank. That's not weird. Usually when something is named like some. It's actually not the name. It's actually not the name. I forgot it immediately. Fucking punch. Shut up, punk. Hawaiian fucking punch. No dancing. There's. I can bring you more? Yes. But, yeah, phenomenal reviews on that. Yeah, not you're surprised.
That's a pretty chilling scene there with the spotlight on the people in jail. Now, this is the part that creeps me out more than anything, right here. Back at home in Germany, they're not weak and they don't not care about us. On the contrary, Fritz said they care about us. Why can't we go home if we want to? Think about it. How will it be? Just think about it. When Germans are the only ones around us. People won't speak Yiddish or Polish in the shops, but German. And not just the whole village is German, but everything around us will be German. And we will be in the middle of the very heart of Germany. It's the first time I've seen a whole Nazi propaganda film. I was amazed at how good it is, actually. Right? So the guy who comes in next says the thing that totally freaks me out. I didn't expect him to be so effective. This guy right here. I think the film did a very good job of showing in a way that wasn't over the top. Something we should try to remember today. The merciless way in which the Polish terrorized minorities. 20 million Poles against 10 million non-Poles who were either forced to assimilate or be eliminated. The film also shows the attack on Danzig. The Poles had always wanted this German city, and it also helped trigger the war. And then it showed that the British had issued a guarantee of existence just before the war. The Polish mobilization 2 days before the war. So we can't really call it an invasion, but really a counterattack. The war was being worked up to long in advance, and the Poles mercilessly provoked it. Okay, so that guy basically believed the narrative of that film, which is completely inaccurate. Okay? The Poles, none of what he just said was true, but the story was so compelling. And his lack of historical knowledge was so weak that he was really vulnerable to the propaganda. And this guy explains why. If a young person sees this film, a teenager who knows nothing about what happened, and there are plenty who know nothing about it, they come out saying, the Poles did terrible things to the Germans. No one even talks about it. It's true. I saw the film. This reaction is possible because some people know very, very little. I'll just say this scene creeped me out more than anything because I realized that I've probably learned more from docudramas about history than I have from history books, right? And plenty of stuff that I might consider historical stories might actually be forms of propaganda. So I feel like most of us are pretty vulnerable to the emotional power of propaganda. Those scenes sure create a set of sympathy for the Germans, right? And I feel that, over and over we keep talking about how propaganda activates emotions, but then you see it happening and you feel it happening, to yourself, and you realize, oh yeah, we're all vulnerable to this form of propaganda. So actually, I think it would be useful to hear from the three of you a little bit about your take on, should these films be banned? Why or why not? In the United States, it would be really hard to ban films because of our First Amendment. We have a law that says the government can't restrict freedom of expression, but Germany doesn't have a First Amendment the same way we do. Do you think these films should be banned? Why or why not?
Part of me says, like, I understand, like, why they would want to ban it, and it makes sense, kind of, but in a way, I feel like people should definitely watch this and see how like, to get the perception of people back then and see how, like, they can easily be, like, swayed one way or another, because, like, obviously we're biased in our opinion because we know what's going on. So, like, we're biased and we know exactly what stance to take, and we think we know what's right. But when you're, like, an honest person just, like, watching the movie and you have no clue, it's easy to take sides, like, and say, like, oh, wow, like, look at the polls did. And you kind of feel, like, a certain type of way about it. So, like, if I was someone who didn't have biases or, like, a particular stance in the issue, I would definitely feel, like, very strongly towards, like, the polls and be affected by it.
Yeah, and in a way, seeing a film like this makes you become more aware of the biases that you might have. Jordan, what's your perspective? Would you think films, the 40 films that are still in the vault, should stay in the vault, or should they come out now and be publicly available to the German people and to all of us?
Yeah, I absolutely think that it's a responsibility to see these videos and to release them for multiple reasons. I definitely think that it's crucial to understand that some of these biases are still in existence, but kind of to be able to fight against them, as like the Israeli scholar was talking about, and to know exactly like really you need to learn, like, if people are believing, some really heinous messages, and they're allowing like these abuses of power, and they are putting community, and we were actually talking about the bandwagon and your the element of propaganda and the 7 elements. I definitely think that it's crucial to know how something this heinous could become mainstream. And while I wouldn't want my children necessarily to see these videos because of the violent elements, some of the other ones would be a great instructional tool. Like, I really think it's important to study these. I just do.
Yeah.
However offensive.
Yeah. So for part of propaganda education, you say they have to be seen. Olivia, what's your perspective? Should these films stay in the vault? Why or why not?
I believe that I don't think that the film should be released. I think there's a lot of this anti-Semitism is alive and well, not just in Germany, but in the United States, in France, in Great Britain, and anywhere across the world, there's a lot of anti-Semitism. And also taking into the fact the reaction people had to Hitler when Look Who's Back, when we saw that movie, most of that wasn't scripted. It was actually Hitler going up to these random people in Germany as Adolf Hitler and asking them ideas about this. And so that to receive positive feedback from a man dressed up as Adolf Hitler is kind of a nerve-wracking thing. And I think that if the films were to be released, I think it would definitely need to be in a very structured environmental academic environment.
Yeah.
Because I mean, even if these films never be released, like there's so many anti-Semitism films out there anyway. Like we almost don't even need them to be released because there's so much out there. And I mean, if you need to ask why they shouldn't be released, like just look at the man who was saying all those, like they did a great job showing the Polish were like outnumbering the Germans and yada, yada, yada. He seemed like he was an intelligent man. He seemed well put together. He seemed like he was educated.
Yeah.
And yet he still fell for the tricks that the Nazis purposely laid there for people to see. Yeah, I mean, I definitely understand the fact that like the First Amendment, and also this is part of their history, that maybe they should be seeing this. But I mean, they do see this. They do see that some of the films have been released. I just think that when the individuals were talking who were faded out in black and their voices were altered.
Oh yeah, the neo-Nazis.
The neo-Nazis. Yeah. I mean, they will take those arguments that are brought up in the films and the propaganda films, and they'll show them to people who are not ready to make those decisions, for people who are kind of lost and searching for something to stand for. Then they fall for this, that, I mean, it's a convincing argument. I'm not like anyone would fall for it. It's a convincing argument. Yep. That's why the Nazis were so great at what they did. But yeah, I think it's just not necessary for all of them to be released to the public. And I think if women or men wanted to study them like that professor, then there are ways to do that. It's just kind of a process, and I think the process should stay where it is.
So
yeah,
thank you so much for sharing. So we've heard really arguments all over the board on this topic, and I feel like it's one of the most fascinating issues of thinking about propaganda history in relation to the German people. German kids get a lot more exposure to learning about propaganda than American kids did. So one of the things that I thought would be useful to do is take a look at, you guys are now in the process of starting to think about making connections between the past and the present. And by reading about all the techniques that the Germans used, right? Targeting children and using speeches and rallies and the Nuremberg laws and Kristallnacht, right? All of the techniques of exclusion to create that sense of what's it called? I think, Jordan, you wrote about it, Volksgemeinschaft, right? This sense of unity. So when we think of propaganda, we often think of propaganda that vilifies Jews as being, that's how they did propaganda. But in this week's reading, we learned that first they created the feeling of national unity, the Volksgemeinschaft, and then they excluded some people from that community. So they were actually, in a way, doing what they thought was positive propaganda, right? Creating a feeling of national unity and excluding some people from that community. That insight was articulated really well in your reflections on the readings. And I wanted to point to those a little bit, because if you haven't looked at this website, this section of the website, since you made your contribution, you'll want to review it again. And I also want to comment on a couple things that I thought were missing so far from the reflections. So Dominique and Quina talked about the poison mushroom, the children's storybook. Jordan, you talked about Volksgemeinschaft. Keith talked about the anti-Bolshevism. There was this great fear of the Soviets, right? Pat talked a lot about the power of Joseph Goebbels and his control over the Ministry of Propaganda. Caitlin talked about the idea that the children belong to the Führer, was a major idea that the new generation growing up was expected to be particularly loyal to Hitler. Sam talked about the boycott of Jewish businesses. Monica and Olivia, you talked about Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, and the way in which violent terror had an impact as a form of the propaganda of the deed. You know, that's the definition of propaganda, terrorism, right? Propaganda action. Matt, I really appreciated, I'm not sure if this is you, Matt Lee, or the other Matt, but talking about the reunification vote. Should we be unified with Austria? Vote yes, right? Now, there was no democracy at this time. It was, it was a symbolic vote, but it was a form of propaganda because everybody felt unified. Yes, we all voted yes. Isn't that great? Zach talked about the Nuremberg laws. Jaleel talked about the Olympics. Peyton, I loved this. You talked about the Roma and how the Roma gypsies were also excluded from the national community. And Madison talked about the very beginning of how the democracy was lost when the Reichstag fire happened, and that became the excuse for Hitler to take over control of the democracy, turn it into a dictatorship. A couple things that you guys didn't mention that I thought was important to mention, which was the authors of, in this chapter, they mentioned that Hitler spent a lot of attention using propaganda in deceiving foreign politicians, right? And that's kind of a relevant thing because, you know, the United States, we didn't get into the war until very, very late because we kind of believed the German propaganda, right? And so the German propaganda wasn't just inside the country to the Germans. The German propaganda also worked outside to the folks around the world, right? And I thought it was worth pointing out that college faculty and ministers of the church were also agents of propaganda during this time period, right? So the college professors and the ministers, the priests and the religious leaders, they were also enrolled in spreading propaganda as well. And not to mention that the Heil Hitler greeting became mandatory. I didn't know that until I read this book. Like, if you didn't do the Heil Hitler salute, then there were consequences. So it was kind of like a forced sense of community. The sense of community was an obligation, right? And I feel like that is a really important form of like social coercion. You know the difference between persuasion and coercion? In persuasion, you have free will to accept or reject the message. In coercion, you don't really have free will. That's the difference between persuasion and coercion. Coercion, you are not free to refuse. And if you think about that Heil Hitler salute, you weren't really free to refuse because of the social consequences that would result. So I think it's worth thinking a little bit about that. And so I thought maybe what we could do is have a little discussion around a piece of propaganda that you haven't seen yet, but that is got some strikingly weird parallels. We're going to take a look at Allied propaganda, propaganda created by the United States government during the same time period. Okay, so we might call this beneficial propaganda, or we might call this American propaganda or Allied propaganda, but it's a pretty famous example. It's part of the Why We Fight series, created by Frank Capra, who was at the time the most famous Hollywood director. What we're going to do is we're going to watch the first 5 minutes, and we're going to see if we can identify the 4 techniques of propaganda. Who can remind me what they are? From the Mind Over Media website, from the very beginning of the semester, you always can spot propaganda because it uses 4 techniques. We're going to watch this piece of propaganda and we're going to see if we can spot the 4 techniques. What are they?
Isn't one like simplify?
Yes! Good job! The first one, simplify information and ideas. Good. The second one.
Oh, appeal to emotions. Right.
Activate strong emotions. Good. Number 3, appeal to audience needs. And number 4?
Oh, attack opponents,
attack opponents. Okay, you're going to keep an eye out for those 4 techniques as we watch Why We Fight, Divide and Conquer. I think I put it up here. Let's see if it's going to play. We're just going to watch the first 5 minutes. You be thinking about those 4 techniques as we watch, okay? And then we'll talk about it. Oh, we got to watch an ad. Sorry. All right, we're watching the ad. Oh, yeah, it's a love letter from the past.
Just more propaganda.
Exactly. All right, there we go. Give me a thumbs up if you can actually see this. Oh wait, hold on. It's starting not in the beginning. Okay, come on now. This film will deal with the period when the Nazi blitzkrieg reached its highest point and the Nazi treachery reached its lowest point. As you've seen, on September 1st, 1939, the German armies, without warning, blitzed into Poland. The Nazi bid to smash the world into slavery was on. On September 3rd, the British and French declared war on Germany. By September 27th, the Germans had wiped out Poland and met the oncoming Russian army. Determined to avoid a two-front war, Germany halted her drive to the east and turned west to first crush Britain and France.
There's supposed to be no sound.
Oh. Not getting sound.
And Britain had one weapon that
Okay, hold on. Let me see if you can hear sound now. Thank you for letting me know.
Yeah, we can hear it now.
Okay, good. Yeah, this is very music.
6 years of hard training and actual battle experience in Spain and Poland had made the German army look invincible. But what about the British and French? First, let's take up the British. They started from scratch, but both at home and abroad, an army was growing. For not only Britain had declared war, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the whole British Commonwealth of Nations was also determined on victory over Hitlerism and all it stands for. And Britain had one weapon that was ready, the Royal Navy. Shortly after war was declared, it had swept German shipping from the high seas. And units of the British fleet were deployed at Suez, Malta, Gibraltar, in the Channel, and in the North Sea, blockading Germany. World conquest was impossible without running smack up against the rock called Britain. How to strike at that little island? That was the question. Between Britain and Germany stood not only France, but the little countries of Luxembourg, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The people of these small neutral countries were peaceful, hardworking, and free. They knew they were in the middle and feared violation of their neutrality. Hitler knew this. He also knew that if they united with the Allies, they would form a solid democratic wall against Nazi aggression, and their conquest would be far more difficult. So before striking with his armies, he used another weapon, the propaganda barrage, to confuse, to make them lose faith, to divide and conquer. To lull the fears of the little neutrals, propaganda minister Goebbels told them Germany didn't want a war at all. It was Britain and France that caused all the trouble. Then it was Hitler's turn. In a speech on October 6, 1939, he made them all kinds of specific promises. To the Danes, he said, "We have concluded a non-aggression pact with Denmark." To the Norwegians, he said, "Germany never had any conflict with the northern states and has none today." To the Dutch, he said, "The new Reich has endeavored to continue the traditional friendship with Holland." And to the Belgians, he announced, "The Reich has put forth no claim which might in any way be regarded as a threat to Belgium." And while Hitler was making these promises, his generals were cold-bloodedly picking out the first victim, Norway. And why did they pick Norway? Its many steep inlets or fjords would make excellent U-boat bases, from which raiders could prey on British supply lines. Also, it would give the Nazis vital air bases. This is Scapa Flow, British naval base, and this the blockade fleet. At this time, the German-based bombers couldn't reach them. Possession of bases on Norway's western shore would bring these vital British defenses under easy bomber attack. But he couldn't take Norway without also taking tiny Denmark, the springboard for his attack. So at dawn on April 9, 1940, the German army rolled across the neutral borders of Little Denmark, and in a matter of hours it occupied the entire country. By nightfall, Denmark is erased as a nation, and the Danes go into slavery. Although only 6 months before, Hitler had announced, "We have concluded a non-aggression pact with Denmark. The Danes will not forget." Meanwhile, in Norway, peaceful-looking German merchant ships like these had sneaked inside Norway's neutral waterway and tied up at all principal ports. That is, they looked like merchant ships. But if the Norwegians had had X-ray eyes, this is what they would have seen. The Trojan horse of ancient Greece brought up to date with new and deadlier weapons. At the precise moment that the Nazis overran Denmark, these quiet-looking ships sprang to life. At the same time, Nazi warships, discovered along the entire coastline, started steaming up the Norwegian fjords. Ships, transports, tanks, men, planes, all flung themselves simultaneously upon a defenseless country. Airborne infantry seized every strategic Norwegian airport. The whole job was made easier by treacherous fifth columnists, led by Major Quisling, who seized power and issued orders to suppress resistance. Nazi warships steamed past silent guns that could have blasted them out of the water.
Okay, we end with the phallic symbol of the big gun. Okay, what did you notice? We're thinking about this form of Allied propaganda created by the U.S. government, part of the Why We Fight series, and we're recognizing its propaganda too. Which of the 4 techniques did you recognize?
Emotions and simplification.
Talk me through it. Where did you see emotions and where did you see simplification?
Like when they talk about the northern states, they very clearly laid out all of the ways that the Reich had said they had no malintentions, and then they directly showed how the Reich ended up invading them, which is just a big simplification of probably all of the war tactics that went on. And, you know, then he said the Danes were attacked and became slaves. So, you know, it makes you empathize.
Yeah. So I think it's a very nice point about the simplification. He lied, right? He said no, there was non-aggression, and then boom, he lied. So that's simplification.
Yeah.
And I love that you're calling to a very powerful word used. The Danes were made into slaves, and that creates your feelings, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Good. Thanks for sharing. What else? What 4 techniques did you see in the last 5 minutes in this Why We Fight series?
I saw how they were like kind of like attacking like the enemy, sort of. I could tell like when like the orchestra, like the music, like when they would switch scenes to like the Germans or whatever, like you would hear like the orchestra like play like a different type of tone.
Yes.
To kind of help like progress like the attitude towards like the Germans.
Totally right. That happy music when we were seeing the Canadians and the South Africans and the New Zealanders, and then the ominous, scary, and terrifying music when we saw the Germans, totally affected our emotions. Good job. What else did you notice? We're trying to identify those 4 propaganda techniques.
I like that they use the Trojan horse term.
Yeah. Now, which of those techniques is that one calling on? If you had X-ray eyes, you would see, and it's like a animation, right? Which of the 4 techniques is being used when they show us the inside of the ship? Simplification, arousing emotions, appealing to audience needs, or us versus them?
I think it's simplification.
Explain, why?
Because I don't know. It's really, I don't think that the military strategy was really that simple. Was let's just have a boat that looks like a merchant ship and then put a bunch of guns on it. I think there's probably a lot more that went into it than that.
It's also that everyone can identify, like everyone knows the story of the Trojan horse. Everyone knows what they mean when they say that.
No.
It makes them look dirty, like easily.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Olivia, that's a really good point about appealing to the audience's familiarity, right? So we're familiar with that story of the Trojan horse, so this becomes a more comprehensible story because it's connecting to some prior knowledge that we already had. One image that I found particularly powerful was the erasing of Denmark with the black magic marker, kind of, right? Within one moment.
Yeah.
Denmark was erased. And I thought, well, that's a very powerful way to activate people's emotions because, you know, people in a country cannot be erased, right? But to show it being blacked out like that, oh, that's very, very, it looks very evil.
I like, too, when they showed the radio tower and it was emitting just the word lies. I thought that was just funny.
Yeah, I agree. As if that's how propaganda exactly was. Just spread through the air. Yeah.
And then the storming of the defenseless, the storming of the defenseless like country and all of the different weapons. And then it's also like talking about this call for arms. You know, even though there was a lot of propaganda, there was obviously like an assault that was going on. That was being kind of like downplayed. Right.
So in a really weird way, this was propaganda targeting Americans, right? And this propaganda was certainly making it seem like the Germans were a big, bad enemy, right? A big, bad enemy that probably could not be vanquished by France and England alone, right? So really setting up this idea that the American involvement in the war is going to be necessary because the scale of the enemy is so ferocious. A lot of times when we study the propaganda of this time period, we forget that the American government also developed propaganda campaigns like the Why We Fight series. It turns out, though, that when we read about this time period, the Americans had a very strong mandate to always tell the truth. And so one of the things they paid a lot of attention to was that every statement was factual, right? They thought that for them to do beneficial propaganda, they were they were rereading Eddie Bernays. Eddie Bernays said to be an ethical propagandist, you had to tell the truth. So that's kind of what the Americans did when they were dealing with propaganda. Now, next week, our topic is going to get weirdly awful and complicated because if you thought you had a basic understanding now of how the Jews were targeted for systematic murder, in the chapter 5 that we're reading, we're gonna see we're going to see that. We're going to see how the propaganda justified the concentration camps, the systematic murder, and it's pretty awful. And then we're also going to read this chapter called Propaganda on Trial. The period after the American armies and the Allied troops marched into Germany, liberated the concentration camps when the war was over, and the Hiroshima, the bomb was dropped in Japan. A 6-year process called denazification. And the process of denazification was also a time when propaganda was used to persuade the German people to come back to the idea of democracy, right? And there are so many messy and interesting paradoxes using propaganda for a beneficial purpose to denazify the population. So that's going to be a really interesting conversation for our next week's class. But here's the thing. I am hoping that you're making progress on your LEAP 3, and I want to check to make sure that everybody has a partner. Give me a thumbs up if you have a partner for ooh, good job. Glad to see it. If you don't have a partner, then you should basically just take the reins by the hand, right? Take the reins by the hand. Look at the list of the unclaimed partners. There's still some unclaimed partners, and just make it's like I don't know what's that called, marriage. Make an arranged marriage, all right? Just take the reins into your own hand, make an arranged marriage there, and get that work underway, because you really should be in the process now of starting to make the choices of the 2 pieces of propaganda that you're going to be analyzing. And I'm going to be inviting you to start thinking a little bit about your infographic. It's not too early when you start thinking about how will your infographic tell the story of your work together. So let's take a look at the Pathwrite and see what I'd like you to do for next week, all right? We just have about 5 or 7 minutes remaining. We're reading well, here's our focus question for next week. How is propaganda used to deepen a sense of patriotism and nationalism and justify war against enemies? Okay? Propaganda for war and murder. I'd like you to read the chapter 4 on the state of deception, and just as you have been all along, I'd like you to identify something that's interesting and put it here. This is turning out to be a very effective. I'm really getting a sense that you're working your way through the big ideas of this reading. We'll continue on with that process. One of the things I want you to be sensitive to is that a couple semesters ago when I was teaching this course, I asked students to tweet about their readings of this book, and they were like completely freaked out. It's like, I really don't want people to see me tweeting about the Third Reich. Just might have a backlash, unexpected effect. So it's like, I'm not asking you to tweet for this part of the course, but as we come to the end of the semester, we'll get back to that, I promise. But right now, I don't want any Nazis or neo-Nazis or right-wing crazies to be friending you because they see how interested you are in the Third Reich. That's not it. You can do that if you want. Feel free. You'll make a lot of friends, I'm sure. But I don't think it's necessary. Chapter 5, the propaganda on trial. Here's what I want you to do, a slightly different for this one. I think we've used a Padlet once before. Maybe we did early in the semester. The chapter on denazification, it's a freaky chapter because it does make you wonder about this question of coercion and free will, which is kind of, should be implanted now in your mind. After reading chapter 5 on denazification, share something you learned on the Padlet wall by answering 2 questions here. So when you click on this link, the Padlet wall is just a place for you to leave like a sticky note, right? And so I've given you 4 questions. You can choose 2 of them. What activities occurred during denazification? And if you click on the link there, it opens up like a sticky note, you see? And then you can type a title, write something, be sure to put your name, and then you can make a link or a photo if you want to add that. Why was the trial of Julius Streicher important? He was the editor of Der Stürmer magazine. Then view and comment on this video produced for the American troops serving in the Allied occupation of Germany from 1945 to 1952. This is just a 5-minute video called Your Job in Germany. And it's like persuading the troops about their role in denazification. And then an open-ended question, share your thoughts and feelings and questions about denazification here. So choose 2 of these activities and add to this. It's like a digital bulletin board. Give me a thumbs up if you got the concept there. Padlet wall's pretty fun and easy to do. Really, you're going to be hard at work on your LEAP 3, but I want to really prepare you to do a professional job with your infographic, right? And so I've given you a chapter that I'd like you to read for next week. This is from my new book called Create to Learn, Introduction to Digital Literacy. And this is really about how to create an infographic that's compelling. It's a pretty short chapter. It's about 15 or 20 pages long, but it has a lot of ideas about how you can design your infographic. And get this, it specifically features controlling attention with comparison contrast. Your infographic has to be a comparison contrast of the 2 time periods, the old propaganda and the new propaganda. So you can learn some really interesting strategies about how to use visualization techniques to emphasize the idea of comparison contrast. So I think that chapter is going to be useful to you. And really that's it, right? So we're really deep into a kind of completing our section on historical propaganda. We're thinking about infographics. Remember that your LEAP 3 project is due the following week here, April 11th, right? So you have about 2 weeks remaining for that LEAP 3 project. Now let me see if students have any questions that are kind of you're thinking about as you're dealing with LEAP 3 or other issues that you want to talk about. Are there questions that are coming up as you're thinking about your LEAP 3 project?
Yeah, so I found a partner. When I was looking at the sign-up sheet, though, do we just put our names anywhere and then just add in what we're going to be discussing? Because I didn't want to commit to doing a particular topic before I have a chance to talk to him.
Correct. So at some point before April 11th, you'll put your topic down, but don't put it down until you and your partner have agreed, right?
Okay.
That will evolve a little bit.
And we're comparing propaganda from the different time periods, but is it on the same subject? Realistically, it would be, right?
Well, that's a very good question, because there's a lot of creative openness to this assignment.
Okay.
You're free to choose the 2 time periods. You're free to choose the 2 artifacts. So let's just say you could take a piece of election propaganda from one time period and a piece of election propaganda from another time period. You could take a piece of advertising from one time period and another time period. But what you choose exactly is really a creative choice. And so I don't feel like you should have I shouldn't impose too much on your creativity there, right? I think the idea is a good comparison contrast should create an aha experience where you see something because something and something was compared and contrasted. You have this aha, oh shit, I never thought of that before, or I see something here that's insightful. So I think you should maybe more think about the aha that you want to communicate, rather than being too literal or strict. If you do a makeup commercial, it has to be a makeup commercial, right? I don't think you should feel too You don't box yourself in, right? The idea is, the point of the assignment is you now know a lot about propaganda, and by comparing and contrasting, you start to appreciate the role of context and how context shapes interpretation. Most of us aren't going to be looking as carefully and as thoughtfully to this propaganda as you are, right? So it's your aha that you give to us readers, viewers, through your academic essay and through your infographic. That's what really matters. Okay, that's a good question. So does it have to be a strict, literal artifact? The artifacts have to be the same exact type? Not necessarily. Good question. What other questions do you have?
I'm okay. I don't have any questions.
Good show. So listen, here's the thing. As you know, the best way to reach me if you do have a question in the next 7 days is Twitter, right? So Twitter me, email me on Twitter. I'm still sharing some really cool stuff I'm finding on propaganda using the COM416 hashtag. And this week, my job is going to be grading the quiz 3s, which I think you guys have all completed. Please make sure you get your quiz 3 done by midnight tonight. That's the deadline. I'm going to close that quiz at midnight tonight. So most of you have already taken it, but I look forward to seeing you guys next Wednesday, 4 o'clock, same time. Meredith, Olivia, Jordan, it's way more fun to teach a class when you actually see real things. It's just so much better. So thanks for joining me today. All right, see you next week, girls.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.